December 1941, just outside Moscow. A German panzer commander radioed headquarters with 3 words. Words that would haunt the Wehrmacht for years. They won't die. His 50mm shells were bouncing off a Soviet tank, at ranges where penetration should have been guaranteed. The machine kept rolling forward, through snow that swallowed German vehicles whole. Its gun spat fire, turning panzers into coffins. And a question began to spread across the battlefield. What happens when an entire army realizes its best weapons are suddenly obsolete? When Operation Barbarossa exploded across the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, Hitler's generals expected victory in weeks. German panzers had crushed Poland in 35 days, and France in 6 weeks, using Blitzkrieg warfare perfected around speed, coordination, and armored superiority. By December, 3 million Axis troops had pushed 600 miles into Soviet territory, encircling entire armies, and destroying over 20,000 Soviet tanks. Then winter arrived. And with it, a Soviet tank that shouldn't have existed. The T-34 appeared in growing numbers, carrying design features that rendered German anti-tank doctrine nearly useless. Its sloped armor deflected shells that should have penetrated. Its wide tracks crossed mud and snow, trapping German vehicles completely. Its diesel engine started in temperatures that froze gasoline solid, and Soviet factories were building them faster than Germany could destroy them. Before the T-34 arrived in combat-ready numbers, the Eastern Front was a mechanical slaughter, favoring Germany by every measure. Soviet armor consisted mainly of T-26 light tanks and BT series fast tanks, with thin armor, weak guns, and gasoline engines. German Panzer IIIs and IVs destroyed them easily, using superior optics, better crew training, and radio coordination. Most Soviet tanks went into battle without radios, with commanders waving flags from open hatches to signal maneuvers. Crews had weeks of training, at best. Doctrine was outdated. Losses were catastrophic. The pressure-crushing Soviet forces wasn't visible on maps showing German arrows piercing deep into Soviet territory. It was mechanical failure, in freezing mud. It was tanks abandoned, because mechanics couldn't source replacement parts. It was crews climbing into vehicles they barely knew how to operate, facing opponents who'd been training for years. Soviet tank production facilities west of the Urals were being overrun or evacuated. Entire factories were disassembled, loaded onto trains, and shipped east, while German bombers hunted them. The Soviets needed a miracle, wrapped in steel, and they needed thousands of them. The T-34 entered limited production in 1940, but meaningful combat deployment didn't begin until summer 1941. When Operation Barbarossa forced desperate defensive battles, German commanders first encountered T-34s in June, near Grodno, and Rязani in Lithuania. One T-34 reportedly held up an entire German division for days, surviving multiple anti-tank gun hits, before finally running out of ammunition. Panzer crews radioed headquarters, describing a Soviet tank their guns couldn't penetrate at normal combat ranges. By July 1941, German after-action reports mentioned T-34 encounters, with increasing alarm. A 4th Panzer Group intelligence summary, dated July 12, noted that Soviet tanks with sloped armor were immune to 37mm and 50mm guns, except at point-blank range, or from behind. German crews began aiming for tracks to immobilize T-34s, then calling in artillery or Luftwaffe strikes to destroy them. This wasn't how Blitzkrieg was supposed to work. October 1941 brought the Battle of Mtsensk, where Colonel Mikhail Kartukov's 4th Tank Brigade used T-34s and KV-1 heavy tanks in coordinated ambushes against the German 4th Panzer Division. Soviet tanks hid in forests, along approach roads, waited for German columns to pass, then attacked from the flanks and the rear. The Germans lost dozens of tanks and were forced into a temporary retreat. Panzer General Heinz Guderian personally visited the battlefield afterward, examining knocked-out T-34s. He then sent urgent reports to Army High Command, recommending immediate revisions to German tank design. November 1941 brought German tank crews their worst nightmare. Russian winter, combined with T-34 superiority. German panzers with gasoline engines refused to start. Narrow tracks broke through frozen snow crust. sinking vehicles deep into drifts. Meanwhile, T-34s, with diesel engines and tracks nearly twice as wide, kept operating. Soviet counteroffensives around Moscow pushed exhausted German units backward. For the first time, spring 1942 marked a turning point. In production philosophy, Soviet factories evacuated beyond the Urals were now fully operational, building T-34s around the clock. Production quality was deliberately lowered to increase speed. A factory in Chelyabinsk, nicknamed Tankergrad, was producing over 500 T-34s each month, using workers who had been farmers and shopkeepers. Just months earlier, Germany responded by rushing new tank designs. The Panther tank was specifically designed to counter the T-34. The Tiger heavy tank, armed with an 88mm gun, could destroy T-34s at long range. But it cost 5 times as much and required skilled factory workers Germany simply couldn't spare. By the time Panthers and Tigers reached the front in meaningful numbers, they faced T-34s that outnumbered them 10-1. The Battle of Kursk in July 1943 became the T-34's defining moment, and the largest tank battle in history. The Soviets knew the attack was coming through intelligence sources and prepared elaborate defenses. With over 5,000 tanks, most of them T-34s, arranged in layered defensive belts, backed by anti-tank guns and infantry. The battle lasted 50 days. The offensive stalled, then collapsed. Germany would never again launch a major offensive on the Eastern Front. From Kursk onward, T-34s spearheaded every major Soviet offensive. Over 84,000 T-34s were produced during the war, more than all German Panzer variants combined. German military documentation on T-34 effectiveness exists in extensive detail. From autumn 1941 forward, General Heinz Guderian's November 1941 report to Army High Command stated that the T-34 was superior to any German tank in armor protection, mobility, and firepower. Soviet production statistics come from factory records, declassified after 1991. Early T-34 units in 1941 and 1942 suffered losses of 80 to 90%. In some engagements, Western military analysts continue to debate the T-34's actual battlefield superiority versus its symbolic importance. German veteran accounts present conflicting assessments. Precise tank versus tank kill ratios will likely never be definitively established. Most historians now estimate that German tanks achieved higher kill ratios per vehicle, but were ultimately overwhelmed by Soviet numerical superiority. Inside every T-34 sat a crew of 4 men, crammed into a steel box, barely 6 feet tall. The commander stood in the turret, operating the gun, loading ammunition, scanning for targets, and directing the driver, all at the same time. Early T-34s had no dedicated loader. The driver sat hunched forward, peering through a narrow vision slit that showed only what was directly ahead. The gunner and radio operator shared the cramped space, with ammunition racks, fuel tanks, and a roaring diesel engine, making communication nearly impossible. Without radios, most T-34 crews in 1941 and 1942 were teenagers pulled from collective farms. With just 2 to 3 weeks of training, they learned to drive in straight lines, fire the gun at stationary targets, and pray. Soviet tanker casualty rates in the early war period reached 80 to 90%. In some units, within months of deployment, crews climbed into their tanks, knowing that, statistically, they wouldn't survive the summer. They fought anyway, because the alternative was watching their country burn. The T-34 gave them something previous Soviet tanks hadn't: a fighting chance. When a German shell hit at an angle, it might ricochet, instead of penetrating. When mud swallowed German panzers, the T-34's wide tracks kept moving. When temperatures dropped and German engines froze, the diesel started. For Soviet crews, these weren't technical specifications. They were the difference between burning alive and going home. The T-34 wasn't perfect, but it was enough. And enough meant hope. On the opposite side, German tank crews experienced a psychological collapse that matched the mechanical one. Panzer troops, who'd swept across France, feeling invincible, now radioed frantically for support. When T-34s appeared, veterans requested transfers to other theaters. Morale reports mentioned increasing fear of Soviet armor. The hunters had become the hunted, and that shift in confidence rippled through entire divisions. The T-34 succeeded because Soviet designers solved the right problem, while Germany solved the wrong one. Think of warfare like building tools. Germany built a precision watch. Beautiful, complicated, expensive, requiring skilled craftsmen and perfect conditions. The Soviets built a hammer. Simple, crude, mass-produced, effective, regardless of who swung it or where. When the war was fought in freezing mud with barely trained operators, the hammer won. 3 design decisions made the difference between a good tank and a war-winning weapon. First, sloped armor. By angling the front plate at 60 degrees from vertical, Soviet designers effectively doubled armor thickness against incoming shells without adding weight or cost. German tanks used vertical or only slightly sloped armor because it was easier to manufacture and provided more internal space. Easier didn't mean better when shells started bouncing off Soviet steel. Second, wide tracks. The T-34's tracks were 500 mm wide compared to 400 mm on German Panzer IIIs and early IVs. In practical terms, T-34s crossed mud, snow, and sand where German tanks sank to their hulls and had to be abandoned. Third, diesel engines. The T-34's diesel engine provided multiple advantages. German designers had dismissed diesel fuel doesn't freeze at temperatures where gasoline becomes useless. Diesel burns far less readily than gasoline, improving crew survival. When hit, diesel engines also required less refined fuel, allowing Soviet logistics to use cruder petroleum products from eastern oil fields. But technical features alone don't explain the T-34's impact. The real genius was philosophical. Soviet designers created a tank that could be built by unskilled labor, using crude tools, in factories, without precision machinery. Armor plates were welded roughly. Turret castings had visible flaws and pits. Quality control was minimal, and none of it mattered to battlefield performance. While Germany struggled to produce 1,300 Panthers per year, using skilled workers in advanced factories, the Soviets manufactured 1,400 T-34s. Every month, Germany could build superior individual tanks, but couldn't build enough of them. The Soviets built inferior individual tanks in numbers that overwhelmed German defenses through sheer mass. This production philosophy extended beyond armor into Soviet artillery, aircraft, and infantry weapons. Modern militaries still grapple with this trade-off between technical superiority and numerical advantage. The Tu-34 teaches a lesson militaries repeatedly forget, then painfully relearn. Germany's Tiger tank was technically superior to the Tu-34 in nearly every measurable way. It was also mechanically complex, required constant maintenance, broke down frequently, consumed fuel at twice the rate, and arrived in numbers too small to matter strategically. Germany produced approximately 1,350 Tigers during the entire war. The Soviets built 1,400 T-34s in a single month. By late 1942, wars aren't won by having the best weapons. They're won by having enough weapons that work well enough. This principle extends to modern conflicts. War isn't a fencing match between master swordsmen. It's a street brawl where the fighter who brings more friends usually wins. The Tu-34 was the friend who showed up, fought hard, took hits, and kept coming. By 1943, Germany was fighting defensively, reacting to Soviet offensives rather than launching their own. The T-34's influence didn't end in 1945. It echoed through 70 years of armored warfare. Modern tank design permanently incorporated Tu-34 innovations. One tank didn't just change battles, it changed how empires think about war itself.